If you filled up a car with petrol recently, you'll realize that oil prices are rocketing. And it doesn't just affect prices at the pump. It means just about everything we buy becomes more expensive. Why? Because of Western-led sanctions against Iran and Israel's repeated threat to bomb the country, which could cause chaos in the Middle East. So, is another oil crisis looming? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. Iran produces about a fifth of the world's global oil exports. But in January, the European Union banned all Iranian oil imports. And if there is an Israeli attack, who knows what the price of a litre of oil will be. The West says it needs to impose these sanctions to stop Iran building a nuclear bomb, something Iran says it doesn't want, and something everybody agrees doesn't actually exist. Well, before we find out what the public thinks about that, here's a short video clip.
Twice in the last 4 years, oil prices have surged, causing major disruption to the global economy. In 2008, oil prices rose to $147 per barrel, and last year, disruptions in the supply of oil from Libya sent the price up to $127. So far, in 2012, oil prices are up by about 15%, and rich country oil stocks are at a 5-year low. The sharp increase of the price of oil has had a significant impact on the global economy as it tries to move out of recession. A common explanation given for the increase in oil prices is based on the economic theory of supply and demand. Another, that oil prices fluctuate with the changes in the financial market.
Crude oil, is not a commodity anymore, is not a raw material. It is a financial asset. And as a financial asset, its price depends primarily on liquidity, on currency exchange rates, and all other financial things, rates of Federal Reserve System.
Another explanation, however, is that oil reserves are being squeezed as a result of political interference in major oil-producing countries.
President Obama has himself even said, and a number of economists have said, that the fear of a war with Iran has actually added about $20 to the price of a barrel of oil. So this concern that Israel may strike Iran or that the United States may end up in a war with Iran is one of the driving factors of why oil is so expensive, and simply addressing the supply issue is not going to mitigate that.
Iran is a major contributor to the world's oil economy, exporting 20% of global production. But the flow of oil to the West is increasingly under threat since the US and EU announced an oil embargo. The 3 weakest Eurozone countries, Greece, Italy and Spain, are most vulnerable because they are the most dependent on Iranian oil. Effects have also been seen in the UK, which witnessed a panicked rush to gas stations amidst fears of oil prices shooting up. The situation in Syria could further disrupt the supply of oil from Iran, and the potential damage to Western economies could be significant. Meanwhile, the US President Barack Obama is considering dipping into oil reserves intended for emergency use. The only OPEC country that has any reserves is Saudi Arabia. As an unstinting ally of the United States, the Saudis have promised to make good any shortfalls in crude oil supply, but in the past they have failed to deliver on pledges to increase production. As the West insists on increasing pressure to prevent access to Iranian oil, can the world recover from the present financial crisis? Or will the oil embargo on Iran simply send the global economy into deeper recession?
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking people why they thought oil prices are on the rise again. And why is it that oil is so important to the global economy?
I should imagine it's the various crises in the Middle East, where a lot of the oil comes from, the Middle East. And cost of transportation, of course, is another thing. And I think mainly the crisis in the Middle East.
Oil prices have been rising again. I mean, why?
Because of the various crises in the Middle East, I presume, more than anything else. And political interference.
A shortage of supply relative to demand.
Great demand.
and excellent value.
Oil prices are rising again. Why? What's been happening?
I really don't have any clue why they're rising so much. From what I know, most of the price of the fuel, it's taxes, so it's either mean that government is getting more money of us or we don't have enough oil.
I think there's increased demand for oil. You know, as countries like China and Brazil and India develop, I also think a lot of speculators are involved as well, keeping it back in the hope that it'll rise. So I think it's really primarily those two reasons.
Oil prices tend to reflect the geopolitics of the Middle East, and now there have been sanctions on Iran, which produces a fifth of the world's oil exports. So, I mean, why do you think oil is so important to the global economy?
Well, everybody uses it. It makes plastics, it gets cars going, it lubricates, etc.
Well, obviously because it runs all of our transport, but I think we will have to find some other solution at the end of the day.
Because we rely on it for absolutely everything. I think I read a study of someone that tried to live without plastic for a year and it was next to impossible. Everything is packaged in plastic, which comes from oil. We rely on oil to get around and to do things that we need to do.
Geopolitics of the Middle East is often a major reason for sort of oil spikes. At the moment, there are sanctions on Iran, which produces 1/5 of global exports. I mean, why do you think the world is so dependent on oil?
Because people use it for cars, which are our main form of transport, when we should be thinking, whenever possible, to use public transport.
Well, without oil, we wouldn't have plastics, petrol. It's vital to our everyday, all our products, our lifestyle.
Different opinions there from the public. Well, what do our experts have to say?
The oil industry is pretty much effectively barrels per oil. And it's priced per barrel, and the main prices are in New York and London. There are differentials based on pretty much supply problems or political tensions and other reasons. But yeah, the oil market is pretty much the market for crude oil, which is sent all over the world and consumed by pretty much every country. Oil is important pretty much because it's the lifeblood of the economy. It transports goods, people, pretty much everything. It is also refined in refineries to produce chemicals, plastics, everyday products that we see and use as consumers. Also, the industrial world uses it a lot to, especially in terms of lubricants and other things, to again produce goods for either industrial use or consumer use. That's why it's important. I think the reason it's been increasing in price more recently is because, well, there's a number of factors. Number one is there's always supply problems on the horizon. So even when we have abundant oil, we often go back down in terms of supply. We have political tensions pretty much all the time. Sometimes these spike, sometimes they don't. We have natural disasters going on all the time. That spikes oil prices. Demand also, in terms of economic growth. When we are in times of economic growth, the price will shoot up. I think the sanctions and more recently embargoes are actually harming Western economies. After all, we're in a situation where the US, the EU, Japan are trying to get out of near recessions. They've struggled, they've bent over backwards to get out of that situation, and higher oil prices won't really help that situation. Having said that, whether or not it hurts Western economies more than Iranian economy, I think is a tough one. I think right now, up until now, Iran has been working hard to sidestep those sanctions and embargoes, but ultimately I think it will start to hurt the Iranian economy. On a simple level, even if you look at Iranian oil production, for example, the embargo and sanctions will eventually hurt the availability of equipment for refineries, for example. So I think it will impact the Iranian economy eventually more, but I think if an oil shock does actually occur eventually, it probably might just hurt the Western economies much more than Iran or the region in Iran.
The price of oil, like any other good or service, depends on supply-demand balance. If there's a strong demand, suddenly demand goes up, the price goes up, and vice versa. And there is also competition. If the price is high, somebody else will produce the same good or service. That is the rule of the market, and oil market is not different. It is basically control the price of oil by fundamentals. That is the amount of oil supplied to the market around the world and how much the world needs that oil. And the perceptions of the change in economy, the change in supply are very much influenced by politics, uncertainty. We have uncertainty on the global economy. Is the world coming out of recession, just as countries? Or is going to be crisis as in Spain, Italy, and so on, getting worse and worse like Greece? Is that the view? Are the Chinese healthy, their economies? Or because they depend on exports, they may also suffer recession? These are really beyond philosophical. These are really understanding of the future. And these uncertainties make the price of oil forecasting and understanding it very difficult. Oil is about 1/3 of the total primary energy consumption in the world. And that is a huge quantity. That is, we have gas, natural gas, coal, renewables such as hydroelectricity from dams, nuclear power, and so on and so forth. But out of this total, oil is about 1/3. And gas is just less than 1/3, about 28%. So 1/3 of total world energy, primary energy, is a very significant issue. And if the supply of this energy going to be low or high, or its price is going to, is very important. So for the health of the global economy, oil is very important. It is the fuel of the economy, as I explained, for manufacturing, for going on holiday, transportation, heating in our light, and so on. We do need, and the whole world needs oil, so oil is important.
European Union and US sanctions are affecting global corporations such as Shell, which are unable to process payments to Iranian companies. So, are the sanctions causing more harm to Western economies than to that of Iran? Well, let's find out what the public thinks.
In a short time, Iran, but they can afford, I believe they can afford it. So in the long time, if any damage at all is made, it's for the Western economies.
US and EU sanctions on Iran are affecting big businesses like Shell, who say that they can't process payments to the country, and also it's putting our oil prices up by 15%. Do you think it's in danger of harming us more than the intended target, which is Iran?
No, because we can probably survive it more easily than they can, because they don't have refineries. Why does Iran not have its own refineries? I don't understand, but never mind. We can survive more easily than they can, so it's almost certainly hurting them more than us.
I believe that Britain isn't greatly affected because Britain doesn't take much oil from Iran. I'm not sure about the position of other EU countries.
Well, both, because Iran is not, it's dependent on oil. That's its only way of making money. It's its only economy. So if these sanctions on it are going to take that away, it won't help anyone, actually, I think.
It does affect us more than I think it affects them right now, and I think maybe we should do something else, try to talk. I don't really know.
Causing harm to the Western economies and to the people who live out in the countries that get sanctioned against Iran, basically.
President Obama says that he's going to go into basically oil stocks that they've got, emergency oil reserve. What do you think would happen if they go into that and all the oil runs out?
Well, we have problems, serious problems, I would have thought.
Go back to coal-fired steam engines.
I think one of the effects will be that the global economy is going to be forced to use alternative forms of energy, and in a way that might be a good thing.
President Obama has said that they're going to tap into emergency oil reserves if there are shortages. Do you think that's a kind of sensible strategy now? And, you know, what would happen if they sort of ran out? What would happen to our world?
Well, I think for the moment, when you start talking about tapping into emergency reserves, at the moment this isn't what it is. It's actually a very clever way of saying, oh, let's do things so as to make people frightened that there's not going to be enough oil. So I don't think that's something we should be frightened of. It's just something to make us feel frightened of.
Probably massive panic, probably start a few wars, that kind of thing.
Different opinions there from the public, but what do our experts have to say?
I think it's incredibly unlikely for the US, what they call the Special Petroleum Reserve, to actually run out. They've got something like 700 million barrels in the reserve, and the reserve is a tool, political, economic, financial, that is one of the most powerful tools in the US arsenal, if you like, for exactly these kind of situations and for oil shocks like this. So it's incredibly unlikely that it will run out. On the other hand, using it repeatedly in any one particular oil shock is not really sustainable. Eventually you will see it dwindle, and I think that will send a message to the oil markets and energy markets and the wider economy that something is going wrong, and again, it's not sustainable. Western governments have a responsibility in the sense that they're often the heaviest consumers of oil in the world. What they should do or can do, I think ultimately in this situation right now, what's driving up the oil price more than anything, or at least the most high profile reason, is tensions with Iran. So following that logic, the best thing they can do or should do is to ease tensions, follow diplomacy more than talk of conflict, to ease any belligerent kind of talk, I guess, in the media and so on. I think that's the best thing they can do. The other thing they can do is, I suppose, to release reserves. You mentioned earlier that the Special Petroleum Reserve in America is something that they're considering releasing. That's something else they can do to ease prices. Allies in the West, of the West, could also release more or pump more oil out. So Saudi Arabia is the obvious example. They could pump out more oil. I think recently in March, the Saudi Arabian oil minister said that they would do exactly that, and they can increase reserves by something like 25% pretty much immediately. That's something that would also ease prices and ease petrol prices for the ordinary person. But I think ultimately what is driving that in the first place is talk of conflict. In terms of oil prices and Iran, I think it has to be remembered that oil prices do go up for a number of reasons, so it can never really be any single reason. Right now, I think the tension with Iran is the most high-profile thing. The most interesting thing about that factor is that probably the US and Israel are the two key things in oil price rises right now, especially Israel because it's considered a wildcard factor. So the oil markets are looking at Israel, particularly because they're not entirely sure what Israel might do. Israel, of course, bombed Syria not too long ago, precisely for the same reason, about nuclear proliferation and so on. That's something that the markets look at and wonder if the same thing is on the cards for Iran. If so, we will pretty much see an oil shock.
When we say reserves, these are the strategic reserves. That is oil which has already been produced from the oil wells, refined and stored as product, or kept as a crude oil in the salt mines in Louisiana and so on. That reserve is, I think, 750 million barrels in the United States. It is other figures in different countries. So those are the strategic reserves, which are United States, Western Europe, Japan, Korea, and internationally there are all the countries which are members of IEA, International Energy Agency, headquarters in Paris, and the IEA as a whole. They have a mechanism to use the strategic reserves in case of emergencies, in case of war and crises and so on. And they have done it in the past on very rare occasions. Now, if that happens, for the US, they probably will use 20, 30 million barrels. My guess is that they would release. And so they still have, out of the 700, there is plenty available. But whatever, these are, of course, short-term solutions. And I think it was last year in 2011, in response to the shortage of the cessation of Libyan oil exports, that the IEA used its strategic reserves in order to reduce the price of oil. That was the very first time they did it in order to lower the price. I don't think we are on the verge of a supply crisis. It goes back to the debate on the reserves of oil in the world, how much is available and estimates of how much more oil we can find and get out from the subsurface. It is that issue. And I think from that point of view, we are not going to have a crisis, an oil crisis. That is a shortage of crisis. From technical and operational point of view, an investment point of view. But an oil crisis could happen because of politics. God forbid if there is the case of Iran, sanctions on Iran, leading to military clashes, etc., closure of Strait of Hormuz, damages to Saudi and other exporters, and so on. That is a crisis. And I really don't know whether it would happen. I don't think so. I hope not, because we are talking only as supply-demand balance of oil, but these things that we are mentioning, missiles hitting back, we are talking about thousands of people getting killed, tens or even hundreds of thousands of people perishing. And that is really a tragedy, which I think the politicians go beyond looking at the supply-demand balance or putting political pressure on a country in order to come into line or this and that.
The past 5 global recessions have all resulted from sharp increases in the price of oil. At the start of the 1991 Iraq War, oil prices shot up by more than 80%. Well, we're already in the middle of a recession, so what will be the effect of another oil crisis? And what should Western governments do to prevent that happening?
No, I don't. I think it suits the politicians to let us think it is. We are on the verge of another crisis. It also suited them to up the prices when the Iraq War started.
In the Gulf War of 1991 over Kuwait, oil prices shot up a remarkable 80% at the beginning of that war. If there was a military conflict in the Middle East, obviously Israel has threatened Iran, what do you think would happen to oil prices?
I would think that it would happen exactly the same, and I don't think military solution is any solution. It showed, like you said, in the Gulf War, in the first Gulf War, that it didn't solve anything.
I suspect so. I suspect so.
Well, because of all the political problems, all the sanctions and the trouble in the Middle East, things are bound to get worse. I don't think they're going to get better anytime soon.
What do you think Western governments should be doing then in order to prevent this happening?
Not a politician, I don't know.
Well, they should spend more money on trying to find other ways of getting around so we don't need oil anymore. If we didn't need oil, the Americans wouldn't be worried about the Far East. They'd just let them get on with it, basically.
Look to renewable sources of energy, plough more money and investment into solar, tidal, wind energy, make that the future, become less reliant on oil, become less reliant on plastics, and move our economy to more sustainable, renewable sources.
If you were a politician, what would your advice be now to, say, British government, to the Americans in terms of Middle Eastern policy?
Ooh, that's difficult. I think that invading a country, for whatever reason, probably won't solve problems in the long term, as we're seeing now in Libya. I think that it's counterproductive, and I do think we really should be thinking nowadays about different forms of making energy. I really do believe that.
Introduce fair trade.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this week. Thank you for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Meanwhile, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.